Who turned Africa into a dark continent? It is a question which I never have found an answer to. There is no more beautiful a continent than Africa, as anyone who comes here finds. But you had to convert it as an image of a barbaric continent which had to be relieved from its own culture, from its own history, from its own. Who created the term witch doctor? As if the medicine, which was a part of the cultural history or of the history of Africa, was part of witchcraft. We have been taught the language of subservience. We have been taught to hate ourselves. In order to create the other, in order to create a rationale for power and for empire building.
Hi, before I start this video, I extend my deepest condolences to the families and loved ones affected by the tragic flooding in Texas. And to those who lost their lives, may your soul rest in peace. You are not forgotten. And this moment reminds me how precious life is and how important it is for communities to come together in love and support. So everyone still struggling through the aftermath, I send you and all my crew, we send you strength, healing, and unity. May the people of Texas feel the embrace of compassion from across the world, and I, the Kenyan Beast. Now, let's get to today's video. They called Africa the Dark Continent, but today I'm going to unpack this one. I'm going to talk about that, the Dark Continent. And I promise you, it is nothing to do with electricity, it's nothing to do with technology or light. It is deeper than that. It is political, it is spiritual, it is economical, and most importantly, it's about power. That's the topic I'm going to talk about, that. The Dark Continent.
What Britain did was something more important than the occupation of geography and the defeat of politics. What it did was destroyed the confidence of the Asian people and the African people. Who turned Africa into a dark continent? It is a question which I never have found an answer to. There is no more beautiful a continent than Africa, as anyone who comes here finds. But you had to convert it as an image of a barbaric continent which had to be relieved from its own culture, from its own history, from its own. Who created the term witch doctor? As if the medicine, which was a part of the cultural history or of the history of Africa, was part of witchcraft. We have been taught the language of subservience. We have been taught to hate ourselves. In order to create the other, in order to create a rationale for power and for empire building, you had to convert the Asian people and the African people into a slothful, backward burden upon the world, the white man's burden of Rudyard Kipling. Gandhi used to say it all the time, that long before you can defeat that white man who has come to defeat us, you have to find yourself again. You have to find your confidence and your courage again.
You might want to get somebody to hold your hand when I say this, but unlike the Neanderthals, we know that Europeans migrated right out of Africa, and we also know that they were originally dark-skinned people. Go look up Cheddar Man and see what y'all used to look like before the Neanderthals and before you mutated and lost your melanin, so that you could better synthesize vitamin D or better process vitamin D. Yeah, that's why you kind of devolved. But it was good for the environment at that time, but Mother Nature didn't think much about what was going to happen when y'all left Europe.
Africa has always been dubbed the Dark Continent since colonial times by missionaries and explorers alike. The Dark Continent is a euphemism for backwardness, wizardry, witchcraft, famine, hunger, starvation, managerial ineptitude, and rampant diseases such as cholera, Ebola, and AIDS. For an outsider, Africa is one single big country populated by uncivilized tribesmen who are not able to govern themselves. The African identity is misunderstood and disparaged. I've been lucky to travel to 10 different countries in Africa, and my view of Africa is that of progression and development. I may be accused of self-denial, but it's not my intention to gloss over Africa's problems. However, I do think that Africa has turned a new corner, and this new narrative is that of progression and development. Down the line, these series of representations make businesses and enterprises very reluctant to invest in Africa. The latter very heavily influenced by the image of a single Africa, whereby the risks of doing business in one small part of Africa are covered across the whole continent, taking in peaceful countries as well. The risks of doing business in Africa are also highlighted than the opportunities that are actually there. Yet Africa holds 2.6 trillion US dollars worth of just gold reserves, and it also holds the largest reserves of strategic minerals such as cobalt, chrome, and copper. Africa also holds 60% of the world's uncultivated land ready for cropping, but is only responsible for 3% of agricultural exports. Why? Because of the fear of doing business and investing in Africa. But a positive narrative would assuage fears into value addition, because just like any other country in the world, African countries need foreign direct investment to help grow their economies.
Welcome back. Now, the dark continent. It sounds simple as you think, dark continent, but this was a psychological tool, a colonial tool. When Europe began expanding its empires in the 18th and 19th century, it needed a narrative, and this narrative was to justify their invasion. This narrative was to justify their land stealing. And they couldn't just say, we are coming to steal the resources. They couldn't just say they are coming to enslave people and extract wealth. They had to create a story. They had to create a narrative. And they had to create a moral excuse. So there is something they did. And they told the world that Africa was dark. Not just in terms of geography, but they told the world that Africa is dark in terms of mentally, spiritually, and morally. Now, they pushed this lie to everyone. Even the Africans themselves believed this lie. They pushed this lie to African people. They pushed this lie to people outside Africa. And they told the world that African people are uncivilized, that African people are dangerous, that African people are primitive. Let me use that word, primitive. They claimed that Africans need to be saved. And to be saved by who? To be saved by white people and the so-called civilizers. But the truth is, Africa was the light of the world long even before white people knows anything. Africa was the light of the world long before Europe came out of its own darkness. This phrase, dark continent, wasn't innocent. It was an international or intentionally campaign. It was like a campaign. They went and found a slogan of their campaign. You get me? Europe used it in their books. Europe used it in their schools, in their religion, everywhere. They used it to frame Africa as a caste place, and African people are caste. When they see you walking barefoot, and they say you are caste. They used it to smear their propaganda that Africa is a land of suffering and confusion. But if you ask yourself, simple question, why was Europe so obsessed with Africa, yet they are saying Africa was dark? That is the question we need to ask ourselves. But the answer is very clear. Ask yourself the question, the answer is here right in your face. Now, when Europe was still lost in the dark ages, in diseases, poverty, and no organization, no science, Africa was already building cities. Africa was already building universities. Africa was already, building governments, spiritual system, and trading internationally. We had Egypt. We were building the pyramids. their archaeologists, we had Mali Empire, we had kings and queens, name it. Before the Europeans came, we had Timbuktu in Mali. Timbuktu had universities. Timbuktu had libraries. Timbuktu had thousands and thousands of books. And these books were written by African scholars in the 1300s, 1400s, name it. We call what? The centuries before even Harvard and Oxford. It came let me tell you, Africa was doing good. Africa was somewhere. Africa was amazing. Think about Ethiopia. Ethiopia had the oldest Christian kingdom with churches carved into solid rocks. Think about Kemet, ancient Egypt. Advanced mathematics, medicine, stationery, spiritual philosophy. Africa was somewhere long before the white people even knows how to bath. I'm sorry if I'm using that word. I'm sorry. But Africa was the light of the world. It wasn't dark, as they say. Think about great Zimbabwe, where we had great architectures. No cement. They were building without cement. No colonizers, no Chinese engineers. Just genius African minds building from their own people. You remember the walls of Benin. I know for those my Gen Zs, if you have read this, if you haven't watched this video, the walls of Benin was once larger than the Great Wall of China. But they won't teach that in Western schools. When right now they won't teach you about that the walls of Benin was greater than the Great Walls of China. The kingdom of Kush, the Moors in Spain, the Songhai Empire, the list goes on. There's a lot of things that Africa was thriving before the white people came to Africa. And they came, they said they discovered this, they discovered that, they discovered this. Come on. How can you discover somewhere where you already people are there? How can you discover a land that is already occupied? How can you discover an ocean where people are already fishing there? So, when Africa is called dark, or when they called Africa dark, they were not talking about the continent. They were trying to erase the light that has been there in thousands and thousands of years. That's what they were trying to erase. They were not talking about the continent. They were talking about the minds, the brilliance, the genius of black people. And they were trying to erase that. Because what? They feared it. They feared it because they had none of their own. And you see, Europe claimed that Africa was unknown. They said it was maybe empty territory, a mystery. But that is a bigger lie. That was a lie. The Greeks, the Arabs, the Chinese, they had been trading with Africa for centuries. They were trading with Africa for centuries. And there were routes, sea routes, and diplomatic missions linked to African kingdoms. You hear me? Trading was there. Our economy as Africa was already booming. We were doing business. When white explorers like Dr. Livingstone or called what? Stanley, when they came, they said this, that we are discovering Africa. So how can you discover people who are already doing business? How are you discovering such thing? They said they are discovering Africa. They said now they are ready to control and exploit. That is what they were meaning by saying they have discovered Africa. That wasn't discovering. They were invading. They were looking for a word that does not sound like invading. Europe had known about Africa for a long time. They just weren't powerful enough to invade till Industrial Revolution happened. They created the dark continent myth, the dark continent lie, to make it seem like they were entering to save black people, or they were entering a blank territories. That's what they were meaning. Dark continent, but for you to think they are entering somewhere that there is no technology, somewhere where there is no people, there is no buildings, just a dark place. But in reality, they were entering a fully furnished house, fully furnished continent, which is Africa. And they call Africa, as I said earlier, to justify their slavery and colonization. I know this part is hard to hear, but I will say this. When Europeans began enslaving Africans, they had to create a system of lies to justify it. They painted black people less than human, inferior. They said that we were savages or savage, not capable of ruling, thinking deeply, or creating great civilizations. And that's why they call it the white man's burden. They said it's a white man's burden. It was a white man's burden to civilize the dark continent. In reality, they were killing, they were stealing, destroying. The dark continent myth, as per my thinking, I think it helped them to do things with pride. It helped them with their doings in Africa. It was a lie with a purpose. It gave Europe the moral excuse to build empires of African blood. And they say that they are bringing light to Africa, but they lied. The truth is, they were extinguishing the light that was there. They were putting it off the light that was already existing. When you look at the missionaries, the colonizers and military forces, they worked hand in hand into Africa. Like the missionaries worked with the colonizers. The missionaries were saying they are bringing the word of God, but they were working with the military. They were working with the colonizers. They were destroying Asian belief systems of Africa. They were rewriting history. They were rebranding genocide as salvation. And this was not just about physical domination. It was mental welfare. Mental welfare. I don't know if you're seeing me well. Now, sometimes I think about this and it gets so much spiritual. I'll ask, why were they so much afraid of Africa's true image? I sat down and discovered this. It's because the world know how advanced, rich, and powerful Africa truly was. It will destroy the white supremacy narrative. They know that. They couldn't let people know that. Mathematics came from Africa. Medicine came from Africa. Spiritual systems, calendars, and time all from Africa. Kings and queens and mighty empires with the justice, economy, and intelligence all came from Africa. Instead of telling the truth, they created a myth that Africa was dark, when in reality, it was Europe that had come out of the darkness and they came and find light here. So they were protecting their own history onto Africa. Think about it. If you hide someone's greatness, you can control how they see themselves. And that's why they hide African history in Western schools. And that's why they skip over the empire and start with slavery. They won't tell you the story of Africa starting from back then. They will start from slavery. Because the truth will empower African children. The truth will empower African youths. And white supremacy cannot survive empowered African minds. That's why they will skip that. They don't want you to know about that. Another reason they called it dark continent is because they feared melanin. There was a time in ancient history when dark skin was respected. Wow. Even reading from the history in Greece and Rome, Africa's statues were honored. I don't know if that's true, but African statues were honored. But I know blackness was seen as noble. But when white people began conquering, they flipped the script. They turned black skin from a symbol of power to a symbol of shame. Why? Because they needed a reason to exclude us, black people, from humanity. They needed black to mean something bad. They needed black to mean ugly. They needed black to mean savage. And that's how they justified the transatlantic slave trade. That's how they justified colonization. But the truth is, they were always fascinated by African beauty. Why did they steal African arts, music, style, religion, and language, while pretending Africa had nothing to offer? They call Africa dark so that they erase the power of blackness, while secretly desiring it. They even try to copy everything, but they still fear that Africa people will awaken one day, or black people awakening. Black people are light, yes, and that's why they tried to dim it. If Africa was really dark, tell me, why did they keep coming back? Even right now, why do they keep fighting for African lands? If black people are nothing, why is everything they build modeled after what we did first or was copied? Why? Because as we are light, it is simple mathematics. We are light, we are origin, we are beginning of humanity. We are the real humans, the source of culture, and the first architects, the first philosophers. They called Africa dark because it was the brightest. And bright light scares those who walk in shadows. They feared that if Africa unite, they fear the unity of Africans. If Africans or black people remember who we are, their empires will fall. Just right now, look what's happening. Africa is rising, black conscience is returning, the diaspora is reconnecting, system is shaking, because the light they tried to hide is shining again right now. So we need to teach this light. We need to teach this to our kids. We need to unite. We need unity. We need to teach this truth. We need to speak the truth. We need to remind our children that they come from kings, queens, inventors, warriors, name them builders. We have to erase the lie of the dark continent and replace it with truth, power, and clarity. We support African unity to be taught in our communities. I support that. I support the president like Ibrahim Traore that is telling the students to wear the African attires. Let's know what to do. Let's travel to African nations. Let's build bridges between continent and the diaspora. We own land. We tell our own stories. We use our own platforms. Because the more we speak, the more the system shakes. And when we move as one, they can no longer bring on those lies. So I will say this. Africa was never dark. Africa was powerful, man. Africa was sacred. Africa was feared. And the world knew it. And that's why they are trying to hide it. Now, I think I talked about something. Just comment down there what you think about this video. And we meet to the next episode. Peace out.